The song is sung to the tune of Jesus Loves Me. The author and the source are unknown. The song is at least as old as me. The first record of it is in 1952. I have known the song since childhood. It begins, Jesus called them one by one, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. The first 15 verses of Mark's Gospel have provided an introduction. Mark briefly describes the ministry of John the Baptizer, the baptism of Jesus, and the temptation of Jesus. He then describes the beginning of Jesus' ministry in Galilee. The first event of Jesus' ministry in Mark is the call of the 4 fishermen. In chapter 1, verses 16 through 20, we have the beginning of the first half of the body of Mark's Gospel. In this half, there are 2 major themes. Christology, that is, the story of Christ, with a strong emphasis on Jesus' authority. And secondly, the theme of discipleship. The call of the fishermen brings the disciples into the picture. These disciples will participate in almost every scene of Mark's Gospel, becoming the most important characters other than Jesus. Mark probably expected his readers to identify with the disciples as they sought to follow Jesus. We learn from both the successes and failures of these 4 men. Now in chapter 3, verses 13 through 19, these 4 men will be designated as part of the 12. This will be the actual call to apostleship later on. But 3 of these men, Peter, James, and John, become the inner circle of the apostles. They will be privileged on 3 special occasions. They alone will be with Jesus when he raises Jairus' daughter from the dead. They will be present at the transfiguration of Jesus, and they will be with Jesus when he is in the Garden of Gethsemane praying before his betrayal, arrest, and crucifixion. Peter, the first named of these men, will play a central role among the 12. He will take center stage several times. He is remembered for his famous confession of Jesus, but he is also remembered for his denials of Jesus. We will encounter these men several times throughout Mark's Gospel. But in our text this morning, we are introduced to them. Our text is Mark chapter 1, verses 16 through 20. As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come follow me," Jesus said, "and I will make you fishers of men." At once they left their nets and followed him. When he had gone a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat, preparing their net. Without delay, he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. This is the first of several scenes that take place near or on the Sea of Galilee. The sea is actually a large inland freshwater lake. It is almost 13 miles long, and at its widest point, it is about 7 miles across. Fishing was once a thriving business on the Sea of Galilee. Fresh fish were rare for most people in those days, no refrigeration. But salted fish was exported as far as Rome. John may have supervised the selling of fish in Jerusalem. It appears that he knew prominent people in Jerusalem. He was able to be indoors at the home of the high priest during Jesus' trial there. Mark calls Peter Simon until chapter 3, verse 16, when we read that Jesus gave Simon the name Peter. Peter and his brother Andrew are fishermen. Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11, tells us that Peter owned his own boat and that James and John were his partners. The mention of hired men suggests that the 4 men were successful entrepreneurs. It is likely these four men had met and spent time with Jesus on earlier occasions. John chapter 1 gives details not included by Mark. We read there that Andrew had come into contact with Jesus and that he introduced Peter to Jesus. When Jesus calls these four men in the midst of their work, and they immediately respond by following him, we see the authority of Jesus. We will see the theme of Jesus' authority demonstrated repeatedly in the first half of the book of Mark. Mark suggests that Jesus' own mission is to fish for men. He catches four fishermen. He tells Simon and Andrew that he will make them fishers of men. In Jesus' call to these four men, we also learn something about discipleship. Mark repeatedly speaks of discipleship as following Jesus. In some occurrences, follow is used in a literal sense, while in others it is used in a metaphorical sense, that is, following Jesus' teaching and example. When Jesus called the four fishermen to follow him, they literally did so. He said, "Follow me." They left and followed him. They would also follow his teaching and example. Following Jesus can involve something as important as leaving one's occupation. It may also require a person to leave family. James and John left their father Zebedee. Now later in the gospel, Peter will say, "We have left everything to follow you," chapter 10, verse 28. Jesus will commend those who have left home or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or fields for me and the gospel, chapter 10, verse 29. We must not misread Peter's declaration about leaving everything to follow Jesus. A little later in this first chapter, we learn that he still has a house and he has a mother-in-law. In 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul says that Peter took his wife around with him. But these men were called upon by Jesus to follow him. They did so literally. They left what they were doing right then and there and went with Jesus. The hired men that we read about in reference to James and John, along with Zebedee, must have carried on the work at least part of the time. There are indications that at least early in the ministry of Jesus, these four men would still do some fishing. Throughout the gospel, a couple of times we read where they were still practicing their craft. But they left their occupation. They left family, at least James and John did. There was a cost to following Jesus, and they paid that cost and became his dedicated followers. Well, when we look at the picture of these four men, as described here briefly by Mark, and as we look at the other Gospels for more detail, we see something of the price of being a disciple of Jesus, the cost of being a disciple of Jesus. We must agree with Alan Black. Following Jesus sometimes involves sacrificing one occupation or family relationships. There have been those throughout the centuries who have decided to follow Jesus. For some, the cost of making that decision was great. Some actually had to change occupations. They couldn't continue in the occupation they were doing. It was not in keeping with following Christ. Some have left family or been rejected by family. There have been parents who have disowned children when they became Christians. There have been spouses who were not supportive at all, perhaps hostile even, toward the spouse who became a Christian. David Garland said, "The call so overpowers these disciples that their lives will never be the same again." When we hear the gospel of Jesus, the good news of Jesus, we receive that call to follow him, to give up anything that is necessary in order to follow him. The little children's song continues. Yes, Jesus called them. Yes, Jesus called them. Yes, Jesus called them. And they all followed him. These 4 men will follow Jesus. We don't know a whole lot about Andrew, but he's very important because he brought Peter to Jesus. The 3 other men we know a great deal about. James will be the first one to give his life in the service of Christ. Peter will be a leader in the early church. John will be the only one to die of old age, but even he will spend time in exile. These men followed Jesus, and aren't we grateful? Jesus calls us to follow him, and the demands are great, but the rewards are far greater.